This is the boring part. It'll get better in a moment. So there's some simple benefits to using a refractometer. So the obvious thing is you taste the coffee, you measure it, and you find out what extraction level you tend to think tastes best with your equipment. The great thing really is that you start learning how different factors will affect the best extraction. So for instance, if you want to know how much does, tamping harder, does it make a difference? Does using a different temperature make a difference? Does using a tamper that fits better make a difference? Does using different pressure make a difference? There's so many things like that, and what's great is that the refractometer can help you learn and quantify exactly how much those things change extraction. So that was something that for years before the refractometer, everybody was assuming how much those things mattered, but it was always kind of hazy. But now you can basically say, yeah, I switched my tamper from a 58.0 to a 58.4. My extractions went a little bit higher. They became more consistent. Obviously, something good is going on there. And you can say how much, and you can quantify it. So that's really powerful. Likewise, you don't have to guess anymore about how much temperature matters. Okay, I'm going to take a break for a second. It'll be a little chaotic. On each table, there is a tray with cups labeled A, B, and C. Basically, A is representing a slightly under-extracted coffee, B is representing a pretty well-extracted coffee, and C is slightly over-extracted. The bad news is they're actually really close. Like this is actually one of those things where it's not as obvious as I would have liked it to have been, but that's kind of what we got. So anyway, give it a taste. There's one little cup for every person, and then come on back, and we'll keep going. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to begin again. Thank you. It's always fascinating with these things when a whole bunch of people go to taste. It's like putting animals back in their natural habitat. Everyone's like, oh yes, I'm tasting coffee and talking about it. I don't want to move. That's all I want to do. And it's like everyone gets so comfortable. Somebody want to tell me something about the cups that they tasted? And what's that? Sorry, raise a hand, talk loudly, somebody. Okay, perfect.
Where was it?
I don't know. You might want to say. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, C was definitely.
C is over-extracted.
C was unpleasant. Now, I readily accept that some people will like A better than B. Certainly in the world of third wave, the sourness in A was something that a lot of people actually like. I'm not a big fan of that. But did anybody prefer A over B? Or did people generally prefer B? I don't know. Okay, all right. C? Okay. I'm sorry? Yeah, Italians will like C. Yeah, I've learned that in the last 2 weeks, yes. Yeah. I could have thrown a little Verbusta in there just to make you really happy, but sorry. Okay, so the real point is this. Again, I actually don't care what people like or don't like. I just want people to be happy with the coffee they drink. But by measuring, you kind of get to predict what's going on and get to zero in on something. And if you decided, for instance, you liked B, and I tell you that B was 21% out of an EK grinder, that's something that you can kind of keep in mind and you can kind of target yourself, that kind of thing. And when you do it a lot, it becomes very easy. So one little interesting thing, so I bought an EK grinder 6 years ago and started using it because it seemed very promising. And what was interesting is that the refractometer was that was the most important day for me to have a refractometer because I started brewing and I kept going finer and finer and I wasn't getting the astringency and bitterness that I expected, and the coffee got better and better all the way up to 23%. And that was fascinating. That was great. That was like a find, okay? But what was also really interesting that day was that every third or fourth brew, the number was way off. It would be like 23, 23, 23, 19. 23, 23, 23, 19. Like there was this weird thing happening and I didn't know why. Now, had I not had a refractometer, all I would have known was that there were good brews and bad brews, and I was really just kind of lost. But the fact that I saw that pattern, I was like, okay, I know it's not the machine. I know it's not, like I kind of knew what it was and wasn't, but it really only could have been one thing. And I opened up the grinder and it turned out that the burrs were chipped in such a way that the chips seemed to have been participating at times and not other times. But what was nice was that the refractometer helped me within a couple of hours move to an extraction level that really nobody in specialty coffee had ever been at before and made good coffee. And then it also told me there was something wrong with my grinder simultaneously. So that was really powerful. And I mean, I hope I would have figured all those things out after a few weeks, but I figured it out in like 3 hours. because the refractometer was just this, it gave a lot of leverage. It kind of really told explicitly what was going on. So it can actually be used to diagnose problems. Maybe you have a problem with your water and your water is a bad solvent and your extractions are low. Maybe you have a grinder that's like, I have a client who emailed me recently and he said, no matter what I do with my espresso, with an EK, I can't extract over 17%. So we went through everything in the world as far as, I even made him take little videos of everything he was doing so I could watch to make sure he wasn't doing something silly. And it turned out ultimately that the grinder itself had a defect where it was wobbling and that was inhibiting his extraction. But with the refractometer, it was great because we knew the EK was low, which was weird. We knew his Ditting and his Nova Simile grinders were extracting at 21% with the same routine. So it allowed us to really hone in on what the culprit was, which was quite powerful. So this is an interesting graph. I think some of you have seen this before, but let's say you have a grinder and you put in some new burrs and you season them, and you find that on day one, the first shots you pull are best at about 21%. Now, that doesn't mean that for the rest of your life you should be targeting 21% with this grinder. What it means is that after a few weeks, you probably should be targeting something closer to 20.5%. And after a few months, you might be targeting something in the 19s. Because what happens is, as the burrs get duller, they produce more fines and also more large particles. And ultimately, if you try to extract at the same level all the time, those extra fines are going to add a lot of stringency and bitterness to your coffee. So it forces you to go a little bit lower in your extraction as the burrs wear in order to avoid the bitterness and astringency. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, this is one of those things where you can't just be a roaster and say, extract my Kenya at 19.5%, because you need to know what kind of grinder they're using and what kind of shape are the grinder burrs in. So again, this is one of those things, it's important to be internally consistent and know what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we can just make blanket statements to everybody about what numbers are best. Any questions on that? Okay. So this is kind of interesting too. These are the kind of things that, like after I had a refractometer for a few months, I was very lucky. The guy who makes it kind of gave me the first one. And so I got to play with it. I was like drunk on coffee for a month where I just probably measured like 3,000 or 4,000 coffees the first month to understand things. And so we came up with this, where basically like we had a Ditting and we had an EK, bulk grinders. And we kind of mapped out the extraction levels and how we felt about them, and we kind of scored the quality, if you will, and learned that the Ditting, we were liking it best in the mid-19s. They both had sharp burrs, for what it's worth, and we kind of come up with these curves of how the grinders tasted at different extraction levels. So again, this was one of those things where I felt like suddenly I was a much smarter coffee person because I had this information. And then after playing with lots and lots of grinders, since I'm a consultant, I'm forced basically to use different equipment every week and to seem like I know what I'm doing quickly. And so if I encounter a grinder I've already used before, great. Like I ask them how old the burrs are. I do a little estimate of, both a combination of where it is in the burr life, and then also what I know about that burr, and I can take a pretty good guess as to where we should be aiming for. And that helps me zero in a little faster. Any questions on that? Okay. So we've talked about using a refractometer to predict your ideal extraction. It also helps you know when to change the burrs, because you'll notice that, especially with espresso, your extraction will keep creeping down as the burrs get worn, and at some point you say, yeah, my 2-to-1 ratio of water to grounds, or like basically espresso shot weight to grounds, is getting down to about 18.5%, for instance, and you know with your grinder that that's kind of the point where you'd prefer to change the burrs. Now you can do that by taste, but it's also nice to have a number attached to it, because maybe you're not always around to do it personally, and other people might feel differently about it. And maybe you're a roaster with 20 different accounts who are all using a Mazzer grinder, and you can sort of advise everybody on the same thing. So it helps us kind of predict what's going on. Seasoning burrs. So the refractometer is very useful for learning how to season a grinder, because you buy a grinder, you ideally season the burrs before you use it, and this means you should put the grinder to the absolute finest setting and put a few kilos through on the finest setting in order to dull the burrs just a little bit. Because usually when they come from the factory, strangely enough, the grinder actually won't produce enough fines, and you'll get sort of fast flow and low extraction numbers. And if you do something like this, if you put a kilo through the grinder on a finest setting, and then you pull a shot, let's say like a ratio of say 18 grams of grounds to 36 grams of espresso shot weight, and you might note down 17%. You put another kilo through finest setting, and then you put it back to your kind of normal setting, and again, you're at about 17%, and you do it, and you get 17 and 17, and then suddenly after several kilos, you get 17.5, 18, 18.5, 19, 19.5, and then it kind of stays at 19.5, that kind of tells you that you've now seasoned the burrs successfully. So years ago, there was this whole thing where people were seasoning Robur E's with, I don't know, I heard crazy things like 150 pounds of coffee. That's a very expensive way to season a grinder. Might as well just buy a new grinder. But basically, I don't know, I think people were kind of freaked out that it took a lot of coffee to season it, and they didn't know how much to use. People were just overdoing it. But had they had this numerical information, somebody could have basically said, 25 kilos does the job with this particular grinder. With this other grinder, 4 kilos does the job, something like that. But the point is, it saves you money. It helps you be precise. If you know that your grinder takes 7 kilos and a finest setting to season, then for the rest of your life, every time you change the burrs, just put 7 kilos through in a finest setting and job done. Does anybody do that? Anybody use the number to okay, so cool. So everybody's learned something that can conceivably, yes? Well, you can use that to dull burrs, yes. I don't have a lot of experience with it, and I don't know at what rate the rice would do that, and I don't know how the rice would taste afterward or not. But what's that? Yeah, I mean, I know various people put various things through to do that. I'm sure that a lot of them are legitimate and work well. I personally just save like old coffee samples people give me I never wanted, terrible roasts, like whatever it is. Like I don't care if your coffee's 3 months old. It's not going to hurt your grinder. Just save old crap and put that in through seasoning. So we always had this giant cardboard box in the corner that was called seasoning coffees, and that was like some roaster did a terrible job, would send us samples, and we're like in the seasoning box, that kind of thing. So if any of those roasters are here now, I'm sorry, yeah. Okay, so first of all, before I talk about something else, any refractometer questions, stories you want to relate, anything about that? Because I know I'm kind of whizzing through a lot. Yes.